Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. My name is Nick Holmes and this is episode 48 called Was Climate Change Rome's Real Killer? We've reached a key milestone in this podcast with the sack of Rome in 410, and I'd like to pause and reflect in this episode on why Rome fell and just how significant was it. The first point, though, is that it was not the end of the Roman Empire. You'll be pleased to hear, I hope, that this podcast does not end with the sack of Rome in 410. Indeed, in my view, we're not even halfway through the story of the fall of the Roman Empire. We've still got the 66 years from 410 to 476, which, as you know, is the date most people cite as the end of the Western Empire, and the Eastern Empire lasted much longer. You can even say that it lasted up until 1453, when the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople, and the last man who could legitimately call himself a Roman emperor, Constantine XI Palaeologus, died fighting the Turks on the city walls. Personally, I think it's too much to say that the Byzantine Empire by that date was still Roman, although it still called itself Roman, but by then it was simply too far removed from the empire that we associate with Augustus. But it seems to me that large parts of the history of the so-called Byzantine Empire should be renamed Roman, since a great deal of Diocletian's and Constantine's new empire did survive in the East for long after the fall of Rome. And it not only survived, it thrived. The most extraordinary thing is that it reconquered a large part of the Western Empire in the 6th century under the rule of the Emperor Justinian. All of Italy, including Rome, North Africa, and even a part of Spain were reconquered. The Goths and Vandals were exterminated. The reborn Eastern Roman army, which, as I will explain when we get to it, was a very formidable reinvention of the Roman army, was hugely successful. So, by the mid-6th century, Rome had re-established itself as the dominant superpower in Europe and the Mediterranean. And this continued until the 7th century, when a number of things combined to nearly destroy the Eastern Roman Empire in the form of a disastrous war with Persia, climate change with the arrival of a little ice age between 450 and 700, a horrific plague similar to the Black Death, and then the birth and rise of Islam. What emerged from these disasters can, I think, be better called Byzantine rather than Roman. And I'm thinking of taking this podcast all the way into the 8th century and the death of the Eastern Roman Empire. So the good news is that we have a lot more history and a lot more episodes to get through. Now, back to this episode, and let's consider the significance of the sack of Rome in 410 within the context of the much longer story of the fall of the Roman Empire. It may surprise you to hear that some historians say it was historically unimportant because it was neither a major Roman defeat, nor did it dramatically alter the balance of power between Rome and the barbarians. However, others regard it as absolutely central to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. I fall into this latter camp. It seems to me that the sack of Rome in 410 marked the effective end of the Western Empire, if not its actual official end. For the official date is AD 476, when the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was formally deposed by the self-declared Gothic king of Italy, Odoacer. But it seems to me that the Western Empire had in reality been dealt a mortal blow by 410. And this is because, after 410, the Western Empire never had a serious hope of truly recovering back to where it had been, even in the days of Stilicho, let alone the glory days of the empire. After 410, the narrative changed. It was no longer about the survival of the Western Roman Empire, it was about the battle for political supremacy between a host of barbarians within the former territory of the Western Empire. And that proved to be quite a battle. After 410, two great empires rose and fell. Attila the Hun created for a number of years a more powerful state in Central Europe than probably any other political entity worldwide at that time. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa also threatened to dominate the Mediterranean. But the story of the Huns and Vandals is for later episodes. To get back to AD 410, Historians have long debated the reasons for Roman decline. Almost every argument has been put forward at one time or another, from lead poisoning, because the Romans used lead piping for water, to the enervating effects of having too many baths. Indeed, one German scholar listed 210 reasons. I suggest that with a little more precision, we can say that the reasons basically fall into two types: internal and external. And for a long time, it was popular to see Roman decline as an internal problem, in particular some sort of moral decay, which caused the Romans to lose their military prowess and become corrupt and degenerate. Edward Gibbon was the main proponent of the internal decline argument and blamed the Christians as the main culprit for depriving the Romans of their military zeal, dividing their society with obscure doctrinal disputes, and diverting resources into the vast church organisation, especially the recruitment of men and women into monasteries and nunneries, where they were, in his view, socially and economically unproductive. This partly reflected the anti-Christian views fashionable in his own time, when the radical Enlightenment thinking of Voltaire and Montesquieu was harshly critical of the 18th century Catholic Church. But the more interesting point is that it also genuinely reflected the views of some of the Roman chroniclers of the time, especially pagans like Zosimus and Julian the Apostate, who regarded Christianity as the enemy of the empire's traditional classical values, including its bellicose ethos. The Romans were also intensely superstitious, and it's hardly surprising that divine disfavour was widely seen at the time as the cause of Roman misfortunes, with pagans criticising Christians for offending the traditional Roman gods and causing them to abandon the empire. Of course, the Christians made exactly the same argument the other way around, blaming the pagans for turning the Christian god against Rome. At the end of the day, the most revealing perspective on the debate over the effect of Christianity on the Roman Church has to be that it was the Eastern Roman Empire that survived the fall of the West, where Christianity was actually much stronger than in the West. Most modern scholars seem to share this view and have gravitated more towards external reasons to explain the Western Empire's collapse. There's now a consensus that the main culprit was barbarian invasion. The survival of the Eastern Empire is explained really in terms of geography. The East survived because it was geographically better positioned. The narrow straits of the Bosphorus protected the Middle Eastern provinces from barbarian attack. Constantinople was also strategically better positioned than Rome to defend itself, with 2/3 of its perimeter facing the sea and only 1/3 protected by the impenetrable Theodosian walls. Economic divergence is also increasingly recognised as another factor why the East fared so much better than the West. The West had a weaker economy than the East, its tax revenues were lower, it couldn't afford to spend as much on the army. One obvious reason for this is that the onslaught of the crisis of the 3rd century was felt more severely in the West than the East. Gaul was devastated by barbarian raids in the 3rd century and probably never fully recovered. The Balkans were also severely damaged by the Gothic and Heruli invasions in the 3rd century. While modern archaeological evidence strongly points to a robust economic recovery in the whole of the late Roman Empire in the 4th century, the signs of prosperity are most detectable in the East. For example, Constantinople's rise mirrors a relative decline at Rome. Constantinople may only have had some 30,000 inhabitants in AD 330, compared with nearly 1 million in Rome, but by 420, both cities probably had around 500,000. The West, having caught up with the opulence of the East to some extent during the days of the Pax Romana, seems to have gone into a relative decline compared to the East in the 4th century, which contributed to its demise. Turning to other factors, the most striking change in the whole of the 4th century and early 5th centuries was the decline of the Roman army, as we discussed in the last episode. There's no doubt that its inability to protect Rome in 410 is testimony to its almost complete collapse in the West in the early 5th century. However, behind this lies a complex web of both external and internal causes. For example, not just the barbarian invasions, but also the failure of Julian the Apostate's Persian campaign, which was the last great military initiative of the Roman Empire, and also Theodosius's civil wars with Western usurpers. At the end of the day, if we had to pick one of the 210 reasons for Rome's collapse, it would probably be barbarian invasion. But that begs the question, why did Rome collapse in the 5th century and not in the 3rd, when there were also extensive barbarian invasions? Our most reliable historical companion of the 4th century, Ammianus Marcellinus, is quite clear on this point. He summed it up very succinctly when he wrote, quote, "The seedbed and origin of all this destruction and of the various calamities inflicted by the wrath of Mars, which raged everywhere with extraordinary fury, I find to be this, the people of the Huns," end quote. So the Huns pushed the Germans west into the Roman Empire, and the critical point this time was the Germans were much more formidable than back in Julius Caesar's day. Instead of the 300 small Germanic tribes that existed when Caesar reached the Rhine, and which, in a rare moment of political unity, slaughtered Varus's legions in the Teutoburg forest in AD 9, they were now organised into fewer but much larger confederations of Goths, Alemanni, Franks, Saxons, and so on. And pushed by the Huns, they were not raiders, as they had been even in the crisis of the 3rd century, but migrants. The great age of Germanic migrations burst upon the Roman Empire like the waters of a dam bursting through its wall. But the next question is, why did the Huns move west? And the most likely reason seems to be climate change and a catastrophic megadrought in the Asiatic steppe-lands, which drove hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, of nomads to find new pastures. And as they moved west, they discovered that their method of fighting was superior to that of their neighbours. Their hit-and-run tactics, the ferocious power of their bows, and their ability to mobilise large numbers of horsemen ensured their success over the Alans, Goths, Germans, and in due course a Hunnic empire was built in Central Europe in the mid-5th century by Attila the Hun, ready to conquer pretty much everything, Germans and Romans included. So was Rome's real killer climate change? While paleoclimatology is still in its infancy as a subject for historical study, its relevance is now crying out to be recognised. Historians are only just beginning to see how the history of the Roman Empire was shaped by climate change. Completely aside from the westward migration of the Huns, as we talked about in episode 12, one historian has recently developed a convincing theory that long before its collapse in the 5th century, Rome's rise to power was helped by the so-called Roman climate optimum, a period from about 200 BC to AD 150, when lands around the Mediterranean were generally warmer and well-watered, causing agricultural prosperity and an accompanying increase in population and economic wealth, allowing easier tax collection and the recruitment of large armies. Then from about AD 150, the Mediterranean climate became cooler and drier. This caused agricultural contraction and a higher incidence of famine, which then resulted in more plague, of which the Antonine plague of the 3rd century was the best example. For Rome, the onrush of barbarian invasion in the middle of the 3rd century conspired with the changing environment to create the crisis of the 3rd century, which nearly destroyed the empire. In Brian Fagan's book, The Great Warming, he describes how climate change has until recently been underestimated by historians. Instead of the Roman Empire, his work focuses on the medieval warm period between AD 800 to 1300, when there was a noticeable rise in surface temperatures that changed climate worldwide. While this actually benefited Europe with longer summers and more bountiful harvests, producing population growth and cultural flowering, in other parts of the world it was the opposite, bringing prolonged drought and famine. And in a close parallel to the Roman experience with Hunnic expansion, climatic evidence increasingly points to the creation of the great Mongol Empire by Genghis Khan in the 13th century as being propelled by similar droughts in Central Asia to those that may have caused the Huns to migrate west. Prolonged drought is now considered to be the main killer of two great medieval civilizations, the Mayan civilization in Central America and the Khmer Empire in Cambodia. Tourists visiting the sites of Tikal in Guatemala and Angkor Wat in Cambodia can see the abandoned ruins and ponder how the mighty were felled by their inability to manage climate change. So too, perhaps the tourist today in the Colosseum in Rome can also ponder whether these ruins were indirectly related to drought, not so much within the Roman Empire itself, but far away on the steppe-lands of Asia. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I wanted to say the next episode will be in 3 weeks' time on New Year's Eve, since I'm spending the next few weeks preparing the publication of my second book to accompany these podcasts. And in the meantime, please do sign up for my newsletter on my website at www.nickholmesauthor.com if you want updates and articles on all things Roman. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.